Part 2. It was like the road from Poroson. The route was unpopular with travelers, and the group went the entire day without encountering so much as one other person. There was nothing worth calling conversation, and the only sounds were the bell on Nora's staff and the bleating of her sheep. The first interaction that even approached conversation came at sunset, when Nora stopped and began to make camp, which Lieber took issue with. With his almond-shaped eyes and smooth blonde hair, he was every inch the spirited young employee entrusted with an important job. He advocated, in a rather high-strung fashion, for making more progress before stopping to camp. But Liebert lacked travel experience. Once Lawrence explained things like how shepherds work and the risks of nighttime travel, Liebert was surprisingly understanding. He may have been high-strung, but he was by no means unreasonable. Far from it, in fact. Lawrence realized Liebert was probably a good-natured man under normal circumstances once he offered a sincere apology. "I am sorry. The pressure is getting to me, I think." Liebert had been entrusted with the continued existence of the Remilio Company. Sealed securely in the inside of his coat was a note for buying up gold, in the amount of 600 lumion. Even his master, Remilio, was probably clasping his hands in prayer back in Reuvenhagen. "Well, unlike me, you're carrying an entire company on your back. It's to be expected," said Lawrence. Liebert looked slightly relieved and smiled. The night passed quietly, and soon it was morning. Among townspeople, breakfast is often regarded as a luxury, and many do not take it. But for those who live by travel, it is common sense. Thus they set off with all but Liebert chewing away on flatbread and jerky. They stopped again just before noon. It was just at the crest of a small hill. The road beneath their feet headed straight east, bending south at the summit of the next hill. All around them grew grass ideal for grazing. It stretched out in every direction. But the road now turned away from their destination. Faintly visible to the north was the dark green line of the forest, and tracing that line west, they could see the craggy faces of the steep hills in the distance. They would be heading between the hills and the forest, across fields where no wagon rolled and no traveler's foot trod. The fields dividing the craggy hills, which were so rugged that they were impassable even on foot, from the thick, eerie forest that even knights hesitated to enter, were the quickest path to Lamtra. No one in their right mind would take that route, which despite its entirely mundane appearance was inevitably terrifying. Though Holo sniffed at rumors of pagan sorcerers summoning wolves, it was hard not to wonder at them. Unless they navigated the pass and arrived safely in Lamtra, and unless they returned with gold, none of them had a future. Their faces met, and they all nodded with unspoken understanding. "If we encounter wolves, do not panic. We will arrive safely," said Nora with a surprising resolve. It was reassuring, though Holo did not seem to find it at all amusing. No doubt Holo the wise wolf had something to say. When Lawrence met her eyes, she sneered slightly, but she soon regained her composure. "God's protection be with us," Liebert prayed. The rest followed suit. The weather was good. There was an occasional wind that stirred the cold air, making it brush against the travelers' cheeks, but as they were walking, it was easily ignored. Nora headed up the group along with Liebert on horseback. Behind him came the 7 sheep, and trailing the sheep was Lawrence, leading the horse on which Holo rode. The farther north of the fields that they headed, the closer the hills drew, nudging them toward the forest's edge. They kept as close to the forest as they could, since the horses might injure themselves on rockier terrain. However, as they got close enough to make out the gloomy form of the forest, its eeriness grew. It was hard to say, but Lawrence thought he might have just heard a wolf growl. "Hey, Do you think wolves will be a problem?" he asked, lowering his voice. "No good. We're already surrounded." Even that obvious joke made his breath catch in his throat for a moment. Holo chuckled soundlessly. "I can guarantee your safety. The others I don't know about." "We'll be in trouble unless everyone's okay." "I truly do not know. The forest is downwind. If there are wolves, they've long since noticed us and started sharpening their fangs." Lawrence suddenly got the feeling that something in the forest was watching him. He heard the sudden patter of an animal's footfalls, and surprised, he turned to face the sound, seeing Enoch run past him in a blur of black fur. Enoch chased after 2 stray sheep. "Clever dog," said Lawrence. He had not meant anything by it, but Holo still sniffed in irritation. "Being half clever only invites death," she said. "What do you mean?" he asked. It would be complicated if Liebert or Nora ahead of them were to overhear the conversation, so Lawrence spoke in a hushed voice. On the horse above him, Holo wore a sour expression. "That dog, it knows what I am." "It does?" "Hiding my ears and tail will fool humans, but not a dog. Ever since we first met, it's been looking at me in the most irritating way." Lawrence could tell Enoch had been looking at them, but he had not realized why. "But here, what really irritates me," Holo flipped her ears underneath her hood. She was quite angry. "Is that dog's eyes. Those eyes, they say. Just you try touching the sheep. I'll rip your throat out." Lawrence smiled awkwardly as if to say, "Surely not." The flinty-eyed look he got from Holo made him wince. "Nothing makes me so angry as a dog that doesn't know its place," said Holo, looking away. Perhaps dogs and wolves were enemies in much the same way that crows and doves were. "And anyway, I am Holo the Wise Wolf. I won't fall for some mere dog's provocation," she complained with a scowl. It was nearly impossible not to laugh. But since it would be a problem if Holo got angry, Lawrence stifled his chuckle. "Indeed, that dog is no match for you. You're stronger, smarter, and your tail fur is finer." It was obvious flattery, and the last compliment seemed to work. Holo's ears pricked up beneath her hood, and her face broke into a proud smile that no mask of composure could hope to hide. She giggled. "Well, I see you understand the way of it, then." It was true. Lawrence did understand by now how to handle Holo, but of course, he didn't say that and only inclined his head in a vague bow. Eventually, the grass grew sparse and the ochre soil more prominent. The hills that spread out to the west were closer than ever and looked like an angry sea. The group continued down the road, though it barely rated as such when they had to cross large tree roots that occasionally slowed progress. Soon the sound of the wind through the trees reached their ears. Yet still they pressed onward, passing the second night of the journey without incident. According to Nora, if they left at daybreak the next morning, they would reach Lamtra by midday. Thus they would have spent less than half the travel time that it normally would have taken to use the established route. Their route was closer to a third or a quarter of the distance. If this path was cleared, trade with Lamtra would become simple. Looking back on the distance they had covered thus far, Lawrence realized that wolves had not been a problem. It was easy to wish there was a more proper road. Of course, a road would also make Lamtra much more susceptible to assault. Reuvenhagen would find it hard to tolerate a pagan city situated so close. That had not happened yet, which made it easy to suspect that Lamtra secretly paid Reuvenhagen specifically to prevent such a road's construction. Wherever there is power, there is also bribery, after all. After a bland dinner, Lawrence sat deep in thought as he sipped some wine Liebert had brought. With no one to talk to, he was left to his own devices. Holo had quickly finished her own wine and was now wrapped up in a blanket, leaning against Lawrence, fast asleep. Liebert, tired and unaccustomed to travel, dozed before the campfire. Lawrence looked around and spotted Nora a bit farther from the campfire, stroking Enoch on her lap. Evidently, if she stayed too close to the fire, her eyes would become accustomed to the light, and that would cause problems if something were to happen. Nora seemed to notice Lawrence looking at her. She glanced over at him. She looked down at her hands, then back up, smiling pleasantly. For a moment, Lawrence didn't see why she was smiling, but then he looked down at his own hands and understood. Holo snored away on Lawrence's lap. "The same as me," Nora's smile said. Lawrence, though, was quite afraid to stroke Holo's hair. The wolf on his lap was far more fearsome than Enoch. As he looked at Holo, peaceful and innocent as she slept, the temptation to caress her grew keener. Surely there would be no problem if he mimicked Nora with Enoch. Liebert was asleep, and Nora minded her sheep as she tended to Enoch. Lawrence set down the roughly hewn wooden cup he held and slowly moved his hand toward Holo. He had stroked her head many times before, but suddenly it now seemed somehow sacred. His hand trembled. Then, at that moment, Holo lifted her head up. Lawrence hastily withdrew his hand. Holo eyed him warily, but soon turned her attention elsewhere. Lawrence wondered what was happening when he noticed that Nora had gotten to her feet, as had Enoch, teeth bared. Everywhere he looked it was the same. Pitch-black forest. "Mr. Lawrence, get back!" shouted Nora urgently, and mostly by reflex. The merchant tried to do as he was told, but he was caught on something and could not stand. He turned only to find that it was Holo, holding fast to his clothes, keeping his hands behind him. He was about to protest when a warning glare from Holo over his shoulder pierced him. If he had to guess, the look meant something like, "Ignore the girl and get behind me." Holo seemed to harbor an intense hostility toward Nora, and afraid to oppose her. When Holo stood, Lawrence stayed behind her. Nora was absorbed in her own work, ringing the bell on her staff and directing Enoch, rounding up the sleeping sheep and bringing them closer to the campfire, and then tapping the sleeping Liebert on the shoulder. Finally, she threw several more pieces of firewood onto the campfire. Nora's movements were practiced and calm. Her awkward manner around other people reminded Lawrence of his own clumsiness when dealing with people outside of business. Liebert finally awoke and, sensing the tense atmosphere, followed Nora's and Holo's gazes, searching for wolves. He retreated, handily clutching his chest, no doubt feeling for the 600 lumion note that was concealed there, as he got behind Enoch, whose tail fur was standing on end as he bared his fangs. The camp's defense arrangement settled, the only sounds that remained were the uneasy baas of the sheep, Enoch's ragged breathing, and the crackling of the campfire. There was no sound from the ebony woods. The moon was out, and there was no wind. Naturally, being a mere merchant, Lawrence could hardly sense any presences in the forest. But Nora, Enoch, and Holo were utterly motionless as they looked into the woods. For all he could tell, they might have been staring at catfish swimming in the black pond. Strangely, he could not hear so much as a hint of a wolf's howl. Lawrence had been attacked by wolves many times in his travels, and such attacks always came with howls, and yet none were audible. He wondered if there really were any. Time crawled by with an agonizing slowness. There was no baying. The only reason Lawrence could keep his guard up was Holo. He trusted her implicitly, and she was still the very picture of seriousness. Liebert, seeing Nora and Holo as mere girls, was another matter entirely. The color returned to his previously frightened, pale face, and he began to cast his gaze here and there doubtfully. There was movement the instant he opened his mouth. Nora held her staff in the crook of her right arm, and with her left hand took hold of the horn affixed to her side. Holo saw the gesture and was unamused, perhaps because wolves and hunting horns were ever in conflict. Just as wolves howled and bears scratched themselves on trees, shepherds announced their presence with the blow of a horn. No animal could reproduce that long, drawn-out note, which unmistakably betrayed the presence of a shepherd. The note rang out in the night and was swallowed by the forest. If there were indeed wolves nearby, they now knew that a skilled shepherd was among them. But still no howling rang out. The group's opponents maintained absolute silence. "Did we chase them off?" asked Liebert uncertainly. "I'm not sure. At the very least, they seem to have backed away." Liebert knitted his brow in Nora's vague answer, but seeing Enoch stop baring his teeth and set about the work of rounding up the sheep, he accepted that the immediate danger had passed. Perhaps he had decided that animals understood other animals. "The wolves in this area are always like this. I hardly ever hear them howl, and they do not seem to attack. They just watch." The young employee of the Remilio Company paled at Nora's words, as though she had been talking about corpses returning to life and rising from their graves. Liebert was more timid than he looked. "'Tis a bit strange they don't even howl," murmured Holo, still looking into the forest. Liebert gave her a skeptical look. This town girl, who wasn't even a shepherd, what did she know of wolves? It wasn't that Liebert had an especially bad disposition. Many townspeople were like this, but their assumptions still grated on Holo's nerves. "It could be aught besides wolves. For example, the spirit of a traveler who died here." Liebert's face went sheet white. The wise wolf had exposed his cowardice. Still, Holo tugged at Lawrence's sleeve once she had finished teasing the poor lamb. Her voice was low, so Lawrence leaned down to put his ear level with her. "I was half serious. I have a bad feeling." This journey was no ordinary one. They had to make it safely to and from Lamcha. If the group failed, whether they ran or met their fate, Lawrence's life as a merchant would be over. He gave Holo a baleful look as if to say, "Don't try to frighten me with your foolish stories," but she just vaguely surveyed the forest. Apparently, she wasn't joking. We seem to be out of firewood," said Nora brightly, perhaps to dispel the still tense atmosphere. Lawrence agreed, and Holo finally averted her gaze from the forest and nodded. Liebert nodded as well, probably mostly out of a sense of obligation. "I'll just go gather some more, then, shall I?" said Nora, perhaps confident in her night vision. Lawrence felt bad, leaving it just to her. "I'll come as well." Holo chimed in, "As shall I." Not knowing the first thing about starting a campfire, Liebert had not raised a finger to tend it, but now he must have felt entirely ill at ease. "I'll help too," he said, clearing his throat, afraid of being left all alone. Holo smiled unpleasantly at him. They walked into the forest to gather firewood, and Lawrence wondered if the bestial aura he felt was just his imagination. Yet there were no further incidents, and the night passed quietly. When Lamcha finally came into view, Lawrence breathed a sigh of genuine relief. With the deep forest to their right and the rugged hills to the left, their passage felt akin to going down an endless back alley. But his sigh of relief did not come from reaching the end of that alley. He had experienced far worse trails many times in the past. No, the relief came from the fact that the strange gaze he had felt upon him the previous night was gone. Lawrence knew it wasn't simply his imagination, since Holo and Nora had been continuously on guard as well. There was definitely something within the forest that separated Reuvenhagen and Lamcha, something that even night brigades feared. Even so, they had made the trip out successfully, so the return trip should also be possible. Lawrence was still uneasy about it, but Nora was with them, and she had made the trek many times and never been attacked once. Relying on her shepherding skills, as well as Holo, would see them through somehow. Then all they had to do was bring in the gold. Lawrence was deep in thought as he watched Liebert head into town to make the purchase. There was no point in the lot of them filing into Lamtra. "I hope everything goes well," said Nora, no doubt referring to Liebert's task. So far, everything they did was perfectly legitimate, so there was little to worry about, but pointing that out seemed excessive. "Indeed," replied Lawrence. There was a reason he used his best merchant smile when he said this. Nora was simply making small talk, but in Lawrence's heart, misgiving mingled with regret. He worried that Nora didn't truly understand the consequences that awaited them were they to fail. The shepherdess before him was the one who would be in the most danger when they moved the gold. The gold would be hidden in the stomachs of her sheep when they passed the checkpoints. If one of the sheep should happen to cough up any of that gold, the shepherd responsible would face immediate punishment. In contrast to that, if Liebert and Lawrence were to keep silent, they might be able to make it through the checkpoint. There was a huge difference in their risks. He wondered if Nora understood that. Lawrence looked on as Nora tended to her flock, as at any other time, petting Enoch when he returned to her side after performing this or that task. The merchant felt he needed to ascertain Nora's awareness of her peril. It simply did not seem as though she grasped the difference between what could happen to her compared to what the people around her might face. If so, taking advantage of her ignorance was not far from fraud. Lawrence considered this and concluded that his conscience was most definitely somewhere near the pit of his stomach. Were Nora to learn that she would be made to take the fall if caught, she might refuse to cooperate, turning a cold shoulder to them. That had to be avoided. Thus, Lawrence kept silent. "Now that I think of it," Nora piped up, jolting Lawrence out of his reverie. However, when he lifted his head, he saw that she was not speaking to him. Nora looked at Holo, who had plucked a single stalk of tall grass and was now wandering about aimlessly. "Miss Holo, I mean." Nora hesitated after saying Holo's name, perhaps needing to muster up more courage to speak. Lawrence had noticed Nora trying to engage her female companion several times, but Holo's curtness made her hesitate. In his mind, he encouraged her, and he was genuinely surprised at the words that next came out of her mouth. Do you know a lot about wolves?" Lawrence was shocked for a moment, but Holo, ever the canny wise wolf, did not alter her expression a bit. She finally tilted her head curiously at Nora. Last night you noticed the wolves so quickly, so I—" She trailed off there, perhaps because she wondered if Holo also had experience as a shepherd. Were that the case, it would be like one white crow finding another. One rare shepherdess meeting another would make for lively conversation. If so, Holo's unapproachable attitude left few opportunities to speak up. "What? I simply noticed them, that's all." "Oh, I see. The men are generally useless after all," said Holo, with a mischievous smile, glancing at Lawrence, who gave a small shrug in reply. "Don't you think?" she finished. I don't— So you think you can count on that?" prodded Holo, pointing sharply. Nora followed where Holo indicated, only to meet Lawrence's eyes. In that moment, Nora looked genuinely awkward as she averted her eyes. Holo asked her again, and Nora glanced apologetically at Lawrence as she whispered something to Holo, who had drawn near the shepherdess. Given the cheeky wolf's smile, it had to be that kind of answer. Lawrence watched and realized the conversation was about to turn farcical. He waved his hand back and forth as if to admit defeat, while Holo and Nora laughed. "In the first place, 'tis not strange to ask if someone like me, traveling alone with a man, knows a lot about wolves." Going by looks alone, Nora appeared to be the older of the two girls, but as soon as Holo spoke, she took the upper hand. She put one hand on her hip and held out the index finger of the other, looking for all the world like a theologian giving a lecture. "You see, the answer is completely self-evident, because—" "Because?" Nora leaned forward as if to say. "Because, come night-time, a wolf will always appear, tempted by this helpless, adorable rabbit. Surely you'll agree that a rabbit who is devoured by a wolf every night could not fail to know something about wolves." Nora looked blank for a moment, but soon understood what Holo meant. Her face turned beet red as she searched back and forth between Holo and Lawrence. Then, embarrassed, she looked at her feet. Holo giggled. "It was a lovely reaction, but no, my first answer is the one to remember," she said delightedly, at which Nora blushed to her ears and averted her gaze as she seemed to remember something. It then sounded like she raised her voice in a quiet, "Oh." "In truth, it's my companion that's more like a rabbit. If I left him on his own, he'd likely die of loneliness." Holo whispered into Nora's ear, but her voice was loud enough to reach Lawrence quite distinctly. He gave Holo a bitter smile, but it was Nora's credulous nodding that hurt the most, as if he really seemed that way. But in any case, I just happened to notice the wolves last night. In truth, it was not an obvious conclusion, but Nora had been sufficiently confused by Holo at this point that she seemed to accept it. She put her hands to her cheeks, the blush was now subsiding, and nodded. Then, taking a deep breath, she spoke, her nervousness evidently dispelled. Actually, I thought perhaps you were a shepherd, Miss Holo. Oh, because I was quick to notice the wolves? Well, there is that, too, admitted Nora, pausing to look at her black-furred companion, who was content to pause in his work while his mistress had her chat. Actually, it's because Enoch seems to be very aware of you. Is that so? Holo, whose nerve was such that she had no trouble exposing her tail when she knew she would not be caught, smiled. Totally unperturbed as she folded her arms and regarded Enoch. It's hard to say in front of a pet dog, but I dare say he's smitten with me. As if he had hurt her, Enoch looked back to Holo and then struck out once again to tend to the flock of sheep. His mistress, on the other hand, was struck dumb by Holo's words. What? You mean Enoch is... My, it's nothing to be sad about. Any male will get overconfident if spoiled. I'm sure he's quite important to you, but that only makes him feel secure that he's gained your affection. There's no mistake. He'll go looking for others to frolic with. No matter how delicious the bread, sometimes you want soup. Perhaps feeling some sympathy with Holo's intricate argument, Nora nodded, apparently impressed. Put another way, sometimes you have to be cold. It's a good leash. Nora nodded firmly, as if she had been told some deep truth, but then called Enoch's name and crouched down to greet him. She caught him head-on as he streaked over to her, then looked up to Holo and smiled. If he ever has an affair, I'll keep that in mind. Good. The wrongly accused Enoch barked once, but Nora put her arms around him, and he was soon calm. I think I'd like to indulge him as long as I can, though, said Nora, lightly kissing Enoch behind his dangling ears. Holo looked on, a slight smile playing about her lips. It was a somewhat bemused smile, and inappropriate to the occasion, Lawrence realized, when Holo looked at him. Because, whether this job goes well or fails, I'll be giving up my work as a shepherd, said Nora quietly as she held Enoch in her arms. It was clear that she had a firmly rational grasp of the situation and was prepared to act according to that understanding. She understood both the position she had been placed in and the likely outcomes. Lawrence's concern was unnecessary. Though Nora might have looked frail, she had survived being cast out of an almshouse and lived through any number of difficulties. She was no pampered noble's daughter. At the same time, Lawrence had renewed respect for Holo. She had discerned Lawrence's misgivings and, after seizing the conversational initiative from Nora, casually drawn out evidence of how prepared the girl actually was. That explained Holo's bemused smile earlier. The merchant wondered if Holo's pronouncement that men were generally useless was not necessarily off the mark. Lawrence covered his eyes in defeat and then sprawled out on the ground to rest. The autumn landscape was cold with the approaching winter, but the scattered clouds in the sky looked warm. The smuggling would succeed. Lawrence muttered encouragement to himself as a sheep meandered over and peered down at him. After some time, Lieber returned, riding his horseback at a leisurely pace. When one carries a large amount of money, he will see everyone around him as a thief, but true to his position as a trusted employee of a trading company in a big city, Liebert appeared unperturbed. He produced a bag of gold grains just large enough to be held in one hand, and after all present had confirmed the bag's contents, Liebert tucked it into the inside of his jacket, patting it lightly. Now all we have to do is to make it safely back with this and feed it to the sheep at an opportune time, he said, as if to emphasize that any real problems would be from here on out. Then once we've gotten them through the gates, the sheep will be received as previously discussed. Are we agreed? We are, said Nora with a nod. Liebert faced straight ahead. Then let us go. A golden tomorrow awaits us. The small band headed back onto the narrow path between forest and hills. The next morning, Lawrence opened his eyes as he felt something cold on his face. Is a sheep licking me again? He wondered, but he saw only the lead-colored sky. Evidently there was going to be a rare autumn rain. And it was cold. Lawrence lifted his head off the tree root he had been using as a pillow and saw that the fire had gone out. In order to have a small gap between the time Nora went to sleep and everyone awoke, one person had been tasked with having Nora awaken them early to tend the fire. That person was supposed to have been Liebert, but he lay there snoring away, firewood clasped in his arms. It was so foolish that Lawrence could hardly be angry with him. Lawrence sat up, apparently awakening Holo, with whom he had shared a blanket. Without so much as a good morning, she shot him a truly withering glare and yanked the blanket away. If you're awake, you don't need it, seemed to be her logic. If he argued the point, she would likely become genuinely angry. So, although it was a bit early for him, Lawrence forced himself up. He had to toss another log on the campfire. The sheep were all huddled together from the cold, and with no work to do, Enoch slept stretched out by the cinders, nestled up to his beloved mistress, of course. Lawrence stood, joints creaking, and tossed a log onto the fire to get it started, glancing wearily at the comfortable-looking Enoch. As the dry wood began to crackle in the fire, Enoch yawned contentedly. Lawrence smiled. It reminded him of Holo. Still, it was cold. It was as if winter had suddenly arrived. The cause was obvious to Lawrence looking at the weather, but as they would be arriving in Reuvenhagen at midday the next day, he had wanted it to hold until then. But the sky seemed unlikely to wait. Lawrence sniffed bitterly. Rain would likely fall by the afternoon, surely by evening. The trees were thick enough in the forest that the group could probably take shelter under them, but with the sheep along, that was hardly an option. The forest was an ominous one, too. Lawrence was not terrified of it, but neither was he eager to spend the night there. Using the edge of the trees as a rain shelter would be quite close enough. Lawrence thought it over as he gazed into the growing campfire, and then suddenly something loomed over his back. He didn't have time to turn around before a familiar face appeared directly beside him. It was Holo, with the texture of the tree root she had slept on still imprinted on her face. "'Tis warmer over here." Lawrence was not so humble as to take those words purely at face value. Holo wrapped the blanket around Lawrence's back and deliberately huddled under it with him again. Stealing the blanket away was all well and good, but perhaps she had decided that was excessive. Hunger and cold were every traveler's companions, after all. But as Holo had said nothing to apologize, Lawrence said nothing by way of forgiveness. He stirred up the embers with a stick, then tossed it into the fire. "Oh, that's right," he said casually. "Didn't you say you could predict the weather?" "Surely. It will rain just past midday today," she replied sleepily. "Anyone could tell that, looking at this sky," teased Lawrence. Instead of scowling, Holo bumped her head against his shoulder lightly. "Wish we could take fast horses and make it to town before the rain. Anyway, what say you to some potato soup? It's been warming by the fire." "I've no complaints. Also, you're tail grooming, right?" said Lawrence, lowering his voice still further. Holo sighed and nodded. "I want to return to the inn as soon as we can, though—" Her face was melancholy as she looked up at the sky. A chill wind blew through her bangs, and she narrowed her eyes as though it had touched her long eyelashes. "A rain is coming, though I haven't wished it so." It was then that Lawrence remembered. When he had met Holo, she had been the harvest god of a bountiful area. Farmers hated a chilly rain during the harvest months of autumn, so though she was far from the wheat fields now, such weather was not something she could welcome. Though Holo herself had good memories of the wheat fields, owing to the many things that had happened there, she had still been the god of the harvest. It didn't take a harvest god to find the cold rain distasteful. In the worst case, the rain might turn to sleet. Lawrence got cold just thinking about it, and he briskly tossed another log onto the fire. There was a bit more time before everybody woke up, yet he still hadn't realized something. Holo never said anything meaningless.